Good evening and welcome to this forum discussion on the latest developments in Russia. I'm Marvin Kalb, Director of the Shorenstein-Barone Center on Press Politics and Public Policy here at the Kennedy School. And I'm pleased to note the presence of our Dean, Albert Carnesale, who is here, and Mrs. Rudenstein, and Jeffrey Jowl, her friend from University College in London. We're happy to have you all here. Many of us remember watching CNN on Sunday, October 3rd, 1993, beginning of this month, and early Monday morning, October 4th, watching anti-Yeltsin forces storming municipal headquarters in Moscow and then the Ostankino television station. A fierce firefight ensued. President Yeltsin ordered tanks into Moscow, and suddenly what we saw were T-72 tanks firing point-blank range into the building that is called the White House in Moscow, the Russian Parliament. I don't know about you, but I shuddered at the sight. I didn't know what was happening. And then very quickly on television came the President of the United States, followed by the leaders in Western Europe expressing generally Allied support for President Yeltsin's decision to attack the Parliament building. It was an example, we were all told in different words, of good over evil. And I could not help but recall that in August of 1991, the people who are now being described as evil were at Yeltsin's side as they took on the old communist system. Yeltsin then imposed a state of emergency, which has just been lifted, or at least much of it has, in any case, been lifted. And so now what? Are we still on the road to democracy in Russia? Is democracy an overused word in this? Good evening and welcome to this forum discussion on the latest developments in Russia. I'm Marvin Kalb, director of the Shorenstein-Barone Center on Press, Politics, and Public Policy here at the Kennedy School. And I'm pleased to note the presence of our dean, Albert Carnesale, who was here, and Mrs. Rudenstein, and Jeffrey Jowl, her friend from University College in London. We're happy to have you all here. Many of us remember watching CNN on Sunday, October 3rd, 1993, beginning of this month, and early Monday morning, October 4th, watching anti-Yeltsin forces storming municipal headquarters in Moscow and then the Ostankino television station. A fierce firefight ensued. President Yeltsin ordered tanks into Moscow, and suddenly what we saw were T-72 tanks firing point-blank range into the building that is called the White House in Moscow, the Russian parliament. I don't know about you, but I shuddered at the sight. I didn't know what was happening. And then very quickly on television came the President of the United States, followed by the leaders in Western Europe expressing generally Allied support for President Yeltsin's decision to attack the Parliament building. It was an example, we were all told in different words, of good over evil. And I could not help but recall that in August of 1991, the people who are now being described as evil were at Yeltsin's side as they took on the old communist system. Yeltsin then imposed a state of emergency, which has just been lifted, or at least much of it has, in any case, been lifted. And so now what? Are we still on the road to democracy in Russia? Is democracy an overused word in this context? Are we beating a retreat from that lofty goal? Four experts are here to discuss this subject. On my right, geographically, is Marshall Goldman, who was one of this country's top experts on what used to be called the Soviet Union, and today is called Russia and euphemistically the republics. He is a professor of economics at Wellesley College and the deputy director of the Russian Research Center at Harvard University. Philip Zelikow is an assistant professor of public policy here at the Kennedy School. He's been a consultant to the Pentagon in both the Bush and Clinton administrations, and for 2 years he worked on the staff of the National Security Council in the Bush White House, where he was generally absorbed with matters of national security and Eastern Europe. Shirley Williams is public service professor of electoral politics here at the Kennedy School, director of Project Liberty, which attempts to help the emerging democracies in Eastern Europe. There's that word again. In January of 1993, Professor Williams was elevated, I believe that is the correct verb, to the British House of Lords, where she is known as the Right Honorable Baroness Williams of Crosby of Stevenage. Is that right? That's great. Sergei Grigoriev is a PhD candidate at Tufts University and a professor of Soviet policy and politics at Northeastern University. He was a student here and a fellow at the Shorenstein-Barone Center, and he was a spokesman for Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev until just before, I think up until about June or July of 1991. Each of our expert guests I'm inviting to speak for 5 minutes to begin with. I hope that they will answer a variation of the following question. Is President Yeltsin still a budding Democrat to be trusted by the West to bring elections and a free market to Russia? Marshall?
Well, thanks, Marvin. I have been quite disturbed by what's taken place, and I share many of Marvin's sentiments. I recognize that it's not an easy decision to have made on the part of Yeltsin. That's reflected in the fact that my wife, who's a sinologist, and I are having these terrible arguments. Should she go the Chinese way, or should we do it the Russian way, or whatever way Yeltsin is doing it? My feeling, however, here is that this was a case of overkill. And I use that word, I think the word fits perfectly in what's happening. I'm glad that he prevailed. I certainly would not have wanted the others to have prevailed. But in a country where there's always been an over-reliance on power and a strong fist, I think this was the wrong signal, and the signals continue to be wrong as far as I'm concerned. For me, the question is, what are the implications for the future? What Yeltsin does not only determines what has happened, but it gives, I think, the wrong kinds of signs. He's been intimidating. And again, that's the wrong kind of signal to send in a country where intimidation has been the rule. Take the elections that are scheduled for December 12th. I would feel much more comfortable if Yeltsin would also announce that he too is running for president, or that there will also be a presidential election simultaneous with this. But it's not. He's holding himself above the effort. He's holding himself above the parties that are being created. One of the criticisms I had of the way things happened after the August 91 coup was that Yeltsin did not at that time try to create a party with he was personally involved. And in this case, he's standing aside. More than that, he's banned not only other parties that were opposed to what he's doing, but he's banned 15 newspapers, major newspapers. And those that are not banned officially are being suppressed informally. A man by the name of Barburin, who was a member of the parliament, had scheduled a press conference. He was not arrested. He was a hardliner, but still not arrested. He'd scheduled a press conference in the International Press Club. One of Yeltsin's staff called and said it would be inappropriate for this man to have a press conference. And as a consequence, the press conference was canceled. That's not what you do on the road up to elections. It certainly, again, is the wrong kind of signal. Just yesterday, they announced that they've closed down or changed the ownership of 2,400 of the local newspapers, which were formerly subordinate to the local consuls. They are now subordinate to Yeltsin's proconsuls in the different areas. Again, that does not augur well for free elections. And when Yeltsin wanted to close down the parliament, even though they certainly were obstreperous, he just did it. When he wanted to close down the local consuls, he just did it. For me, however, as an economist, the thing that I worry about in the future, and the thing that I think is going to come back to haunt him, is the economy. I'm not sure, even if he solves all the constitutional problems, even if he works his way out of the political difficulties that he's found himself in, that it will do anything to improve the economy. The issues are fundamental, have been built up over 70 years, and are not things that are going to go away. And more than that, I've also been critical of the way the economic processes have been, reforms have been worked out. I'm not a proponent of shock therapy. I think, in fact, the way shock therapy is being administered in a society where the market infrastructure is underdeveloped or not developed at all, it only serves to exacerbate the problems. And what happens is that in the process, you're enriching not only the state owners of the factories, but in effect, the new owners who take over and very often simply confiscate what goes on. And what you have then are these massive state industrial monopolies, which are being privatized. And they're being privatized, and they're still in monopolies, they're still industrial dinosaurs. And it seems to me that's not the way to solve it. In the meantime, as you continue to have prices increase without groups that are able to respond to it with some kind of elasticity, you end up with the worst of capitalism, and that's what people are seeing. And I think as long as that happens, for me the implication is economic problems will precipitate political problems, and what we've just seen these last few weeks is not an anomaly, not a random event, but it will be the one of many recurring episodes in the future. Let me conclude. As far as I'm concerned, the economic prospects will not be solved, will not improve radically. There may be some improvement, but not enough to benefit the population as a whole. And if that continues to happen, then I think we have to see, I say, these recurring political problems. Now, it's not simple. You sit back and you say, well, maybe it's all right to have this happen in Chile, or maybe it's all right to have strong government take place in China, and then you get the reforms. Maybe Yeltsin needs this iron hand to move ahead, to bring about the reforms that are going, that ultimately will evolve, we hope. But it's easy to clamp down. It's not so easy to relent, particularly in a society which has always had this history of centuries of clamping down. And it's true that many of the people in Russia are applauding what Yeltsin is doing, the state of emergency. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's right. And it's particularly disturbing for me to note that, unlike what took place in August 91, where there were hundreds of thousands of people on the street supporting reform, this time there were just a few thousand, and there were almost as many supporting the members of Parliament. It was like the dog that didn't bark. These people did not appear. Many of them felt indifferent. Many of them felt a plague on everyone. Many of them felt, indeed, that the situation that they find themselves in is so bad that they're just not worth protesting. What does it mean for the United States? It seems to me that this should be a warning signal. And we should prevent, as Marvin said, a repetition of what happened between George Bush and Mikhail Gorbachev. I also would say that I think Clinton made some serious mistakes here. I think that he was wrong when he said, even before the violence took place, when the parliament was closed down, that this is the way democracies work out their problems. I certainly hope that that's not the case.
Thank you very much, Marshall. Phil?
The original question, you may recall, was, do I think Yeltsin will be a good Democrat and a good free marketer?
Budding Democrat.
A budding Democrat, blossoming perhaps next year in the summertime, and a good market reformer. The answer to this question is, I don't know. This is too hard a question for me. So I asked myself some different questions, which is, first question was, I asked 3 other questions. One
That's
was,
what they teach them here.
why do I care about the answer to Marvin's question? The first reason I care is because it's intellectually very interesting. It's a knotty problem. Frankly, it's a tangle. So it's intellectually very interesting. The other reason I care is because it matters enormously to U.S. national security interests. Now, that's something I do care about. It's something I even know a tiny bit about. So I sat down and thought, well, what is it about U.S. national security interests that are affected by the answers to Marvin's question? I can think of 4 such interests. Just tick them off quickly. 1, what happens to the 30,000 plus thermonuclear weapons in the former Soviet Union? I care about the answer to that question. What happens to Russia's cooperation in what President Clinton has called global problem solving, like global problem solving in Bosnia? That's an important question. What does this mean for Russia's policies toward her neighbors, like Azerbaijan or Georgia or Tajikistan or Ukraine or Estonia, some of which I care more about than others, and some of which the United States cares more about for others? For example, if I make an intellectual projection, which I did publicly recently, which is to guess that there is a less than 60% chance that the Ukrainian nation state will exist in its current form 2 years from today. You may disagree with that. You may have a different estimate. If that estimate is even close to being true, well, I care about the answers to all the questions that fall out of that projection. And fourth, I can identify a U.S. interest in not seeing Russia sell good arms to bad people, because most of those bad people don't like us. So if that's my first question, then the second question I ask myself is, well, what do I think are the answers to the question I posed myself, which is, how are we doing with respect to U.S. national security interests? And the answers are all troubling, and I won't go through them all. If you're interested in one or another of them, you can ask about them. I'll just mention that we have a country now that has 30,000 plus thermonuclear weapons. You don't have to be a math wizard to figure out that it doesn't take a very large fraction of these to do enormous and calamitous harm to the world. And then you ask yourself, are you sure that the Russian government has 99 44/100% control over anything in Russia? Anything. And then just work out the math. And if you conclude that you're troubled, you're right. And we can elaborate much more on why you should be troubled and get into all the details you want. So then the third question I asked myself is, well, given these answers, the immediate policy question before my government is, do I aid Yeltsin in the guise of aiding reform, aid him with billions of dollars? And I answer that question, yes, yes, but, do not believe that the triumph of, quote, reformers, close quote, whatever that means that any of the problems I mentioned above are thereby solved. Yes, but do not believe that progress toward Russian economic recovery, even if it's not a chimera, will actually induce political stability. Yes, but judge progress in achieving U.S. objectives not by the relative indices of political and economic progress, but instead by the concrete measures of U.S. security using the benchmarks I mentioned a few minutes ago. And yes, but defend your aid program solely by reference to those concrete benchmarks in U.S. national security interests. Because I'll tell you, most of the U.S. Congress and an even larger portion of the American people care much more about the answers to my questions.
Phil, I am hearing your answer to my question as being no, comma, but possibly yes.
Or yes
Because
and no,
everything-
I'm not sure I care. I do care what his
I thought you cared
policies
about
are.
U.S.
Yeah, but I care more about what Yeltsin does than what Yeltsin is.
Good. Okay. Professor Williams.
Well, Marshall's an expert and Phil is a policy analyst, and I'm a politician, so I don't know how to answer questions by providing other questions. So I'll have a go at trying to provide an answer.
Thank you.
My straight answer to Marvin is no. And why would you expect him to be? Boris Yeltsin hasn't come out of a democratic background. He's in a country where there's no thing one could recognize as a civic society. He's in a country that's never had the experience of what it is to see the state and the government as two different things, but always as the same thing. So why should he be a budding Democrat? He may be a very benevolent despot. He may even someday want democracy, but I think that we would be very foolish to think that Yeltsin was in any sense that we understand by the term, and we have to use terms in the way that we in this country use them. He clearly isn't a Democrat. How could he be a Democrat? So the question is were we right to back him as a benevolent despot? My view is that we've taken one hell of a risk. The most troubling thing is that, like it or not, and there may, as Marshall said, not have been much alternative, and I rather share Marshall's feeling of you have to hold your nose and jump. Nevertheless, there is real damage by the fact that Yeltsin overturned the Constitution, because although we know it is a lousy constitution, overturning constitutions is not the best preamble to actually respecting constitutions in a country where the concept of obeying the rule of law is at best in its very early stages. So that's the first point I want to make. The second point I want to make is that I think that Yeltsin's victory is based on an extraordinarily narrow margin of advantage. It looks clear from his history that Boris Yeltsin is a great risk taker, and that's to his credit because he is leading Russia and not leading the United States or Sweden. He has to be a risk taker, but I think we ought to be under no illusion about the scale of the risk. If you look at the reluctance that the military showed to intervene at all until the very last moment, Yeltsin must have taken his position, though Sergei will tell us whether this is right, without knowing for certain whether the Army, Air Force, and Navy would back him. And we have reason to believe, again, tell me if I'm wrong, that the older regiments of the Army, the ones with older officers, were in fact deeply skeptical about Yeltsin, about what he was doing, and were profoundly resentful at what they saw as the undermining of Russian power. He depended upon the paratroops and a couple of elite regiments close to Moscow who were very closely associated with the Ministry of Defense, Mr. Grachev, and on whose loyalty he could for that moment rely. But it's not like Deng and the Chinese army. There is nothing like the same solidarity, I believe, in the military that we've seen in some other countries where the leader can call upon the military with a certainty they will come in. And I hand it to Boris Yeltsin. It was a brilliant piece, a ballet in which he stood for a very long time on his tiptoes until he was saved. The third thing I want to say is that I believe he's still taking a great risk with the regions. I think that his proposal that there should be an upper house in which the regions are represented, the house of the federal house or the federation house, it's a matter of how you translate it, is a brilliant ploy and has gone some way to bring the regions on his side in a situation where they could have gone the other way, and some are still standing on the sidelines waiting to see what way they jump. But Yeltsin has in effect indicated that in the proposals he's now laying before the electorate and ultimately before the Constituent Assembly, the new parliament, he has made it clear that he wants an upper house in which the regions will be represented. And don't forget that in the previous upper house that was not the case. Finally, I want to ask Sergei this question because I think he may know better than anybody else as Gorbachev's spokesman whether my suspicion is right or not. General Grachev, the Minister of Defense, and I repeat, the person who I believe at least was absolutely key to Yeltsin being able to pull the rug out from under Parliament, which was, after all, led by two men with long military histories, one of them a hero of the Afghan War, means that Yeltsin is extremely dependent on this close relationship and friendship with Gorbachev. Gorbachev has made it plain on more than one occasion that he's profoundly opposed to the breakup of the CIS. In particular, he said in specific terms that if Ukraine and Georgia control the Black Sea ports, this would be an insupportable blow to Russia. And he has undoubtedly been very much involved in the support of the Abkhazian rebels, who are now going well outside Abkhazia and beginning to threaten Georgia itself. Shevardnadze, I suspect, is no friend of the present regime in Russia, and they wouldn't mind seeing him humiliated. But it goes further than that. There are also clear indications of Russian military support for the Armenians against the Azeris, in Tajikistan in the same way, the purpose being, I believe, to recreate in some form the CIS as essentially the near abroad of Russia. If that's right, we're only at the beginning of the problems we now have to encounter. And I will conclude by saying this. If Russia is successful, and I would take a big bet they will be, in recreating some new form of the Soviet Union, not as tight as the Soviet Union, but one in which Ukraine and Georgia and Tajikistan and Kazakhstan and Belarus and the others turn to Moscow before they take definitive steps. And I would tend to agree with Phil's 60% bet, something like 60% likelihood that Ukraine won't be an independent, a truly independent state in 2 years' time, maybe nominally one. That leads me to a final statement, or if you like, issue for discussion, depending on Marvin, and that is what the West does. The West is in grave danger now of drawing a new line, a new kind of Iron Curtain, which moves from the line through East and West Germany to the line between Poland and the lands beyond. In other words, to put it very crudely, the eastern border of Poland is where civilization stops. Poland will be allowed to be associated with NATO. Poland will be allowed to join the European community. Poland is okay. The danger of that is that we could recreate a new Cold War by our failure to recognize the need to blur, in my view, these borders, by accepting the CIS as a free trade area partner of the West, and possibly by drawing up a non-aggression treaty with NATO so that we do not create a new border. Last point of all, I think sadly, much as I admire him in domestic affairs, that President Clinton is showing very strong signs of finding it almost impossible to take any kind of a strong line in foreign policy if it might involve military action. Dick and I were talking about this in terms of President Clinton's own history. I respect that history, but I also suspect it creates tremendous psychological problems for him in authorizing military actions. And my own view is that he's got to authorize a military action where it is needed. Maybe hate is not a bad example, in order to regain the authority that the President of the United States must have in a world as chaotic as the one in which we live at the present time.
Thank you very much. Sergei. Sergei Grigoriev.
Thank you. Well, I will certainly say that I will have to ask less questions because the trend here was that people were asking questions and answering those questions, and probably I'll try to take less time, but offer some of my views here. First of all, to give the assessment of the situation, I think we have to understand that with what happened in Russia some 2 weeks ago, it's a terrible national tragedy, and we shouldn't really underestimate the significance of it and all the negative implications. We don't know exactly how many people were killed, but it is clear from eyewitnesses' stories and from other reports that it was much more than the official figures showed, much more human lives taken away, and this really affects a lot of people. There's a lot of, or there was at least during the first week after the crackdown on the opposition, there was a lot of euphoria in the world, and what I did not like is the usage of the terms which are quite right describing certain things in the West, like hardliners and Democrats and all sorts of things. I think that probably we don't know yet enough words, or did not invent enough words for the academic world to use related to this situation. But I definitely think that this is a much more complicated story than describing hardliners on one hand, and although there were hardliners and real hardliners and extremists and well-armed extremists, this is right. But I think that what happened in this confrontation between Yeltsin and the forces surrounding the parliament, it's a much deeper thing that shows the state of the Russian society today. I think that, of course, and I'll talk about it later, I would use the word good guys probably, since I couldn't find a better word about who won. And they're good guys because they're our guys, and because it's more important, and I agree here, it was much more important for the whole world for the Yeltsin forces to win, because at a certain point on that Sunday I was scared, sitting in front of my TV, saying, what will happen if the other bunch will take over? I mean, that certainly is a choice between the, probably the evils, if I will describe this, but you know, we've put on the better evil, and our has won. So, I mean, we shouldn't be disappointed, despite the fact that there's a number of real concerns that flow from this situation. Marvin has asked the question about the correlation here of democracy and how much we describe Yeltsin as a Democrat. I think that by going in the direction of violation of the Constitution that he himself was sworn in, and by going beyond certain limits, Yeltsin has put an end to that Russian state that we all knew between August of 1991 and September of 1993. That Russia is gone. It's the beginning of a new republic. I don't know, fifth or sixth republic, we can all count, but it's a qualitatively new and different situation. And under the circumstances, the way I see it today, because I certainly anticipate new troubles, I would describe it like we don't have to use the word democracy probably here, because we have to have other priorities. Whether we go in favor of stability, which certainly is in the interests of all of us here, and like Mr. Zelikov was just stressing here, or we go for democracy, because I think that today in Russia it's impossible to speak about the combination of stability and democracy. And certainly certain choices have to be made. In general, it's clear that one might agree with what Senator Nunn was saying, and emotionally I agree much more with what was said in his interview when Senator Nunn stressed that we don't have to put on individuals. We have to put on the process of democratic change. But on the other hand, I sort of do not understand that how it can be combined together. Speaking about the leadership today, I think that Yeltsin has a very important role to play in terms of mobilization of his own people, his own lieutenants for the economic reform. It's another big and most serious question that has to be dealt with, and I think that under the circumstances, and we all heard from what Marshal Goldman was saying, this is another most important aspect. When we speak about the parliament, I mean, it's just, I don't think it's enough to say that this parliament was not bad. I would not even say that this parliament was bad. It was terrible. It was a terrible parliament. But this parliament was reflecting all the backwardness of Russia's provinces. This parliament at a certain point became a rallying point for a lot of people who were unhappy about the course of the reforms, who were unhappy about the deterioration of their economic standards. And I think that it is very dangerous to ignore their situation and their views. One of the ideas I had in mind of why Yeltsin went for such a tough step, I thought that, well, he has to change his line in shock therapy because it's obvious that the majority of the people are not approving the shock therapy. He has to change the course of privatization because, as the studies done by the London School of Economics show, the privatization, although it's going on and achieved certain successes, is not actually doing that much of good for the economy, especially at this point. If he has to reorient his course in a certain way, if he has to go for some other policy directions, he was inevitably running in admitting that some of the things that this parliament was saying were right. And the parliament was saying that these things were right, not because the parliament was good again, I say, but just because the level of confrontation was such. If Yeltsin was saying that something was white, the parliament was immediately saying that the parliament was black, and vice versa. But at that point, there is another good saying to be used, at least a Russian saying: the winners are usually not judged. Now it's safer for Yeltsin to switch his course, to take the attitudes of those people who are already in jail, and I believe that pretty soon we will see a lot of corrections in his line. Another thing, of course, that we have to go for and study, it's the problems of relations between Russia and the West. And I believe that in terms of US national security interests, it's definitely not democracy. It's definitely stability that has to be put on as a priority thing. And I think that what Philip Zelikow was saying is very logical in terms of US national security interests. But I see some other negative implications coming here. First of all, that fact that Yeltsin actually was, again, until the last moment, depending so much until the last ditch effort, whether the military, to convince the military to come to his rescue or not, do something. Does it make the West feel secure that next time something will not happen? Does this make the West feel kind of safe? I don't know. I mean, again, this is the time when I will ask a question. I mean, even here, being in a nice place in Cambridge, I don't feel that much secure with a leadership like this, which at the last moment finally brings the army, having appealed to its own citizens to come and surround the Kremlin and to erect other useless barricades. That was one more thing. I think in many ways, and probably this is something bad that I will say and that people will not like here, but it's another repetition of the situation with Gorbachev. And it's not because I don't like and don't respect Gorbachev, but I think the height of the Western support for Gorbachev came at the point when Gorbachev was no longer relevant in his own country. And I think that right now, the West puts all its pressure behind Yeltsin, when Yeltsin, for most of his people, in his own country, has become irrelevant. If we're not thinking about this, if we don't want to admit this, at least honestly in front of each other, then there's no use to have any kind of discussions and come to any serious political meetings. I think the important thing today is to see who comes next. And what is the way to see to it that there's another, two more little things, I'm sorry. Yes, it's here. One more thing about Russia and NATO, and I have to answer a question. I mean, after Yeltsin's maneuver here with all sorts of things, and after all the explosive situation in Moscow, don't you think that the Visegrad countries have now a much more legitimate request to become NATO members? Don't you think that it strengthens their argumentation? I think it's a much more legitimate request, and the sooner they will all become NATO members, the better it will be for European security and for all of them, and for NATO as well. There's a number of other things. Of course, I can continue, but I have to answer a question that I was asked.
Did anybody ask you a question?
Yes. I'm sorry. I don't view it as censorship, a la Yeltsin style. Not at all, but I just want to answer the question. The question is about the Army and the role of the Army. And what, yes, you did ask me this question. Yeah. What I will say that the troops that we saw acting in Moscow, in fact, are not the Army. These are the elite troops. The army today claims credit for what has happened. But the most important thing for Yeltsin was not to get Gorbachev on the move. The most important thing was for Gorbachev and others to assure Yeltsin that the troops will not go against. Today's newspaper, Izvestia, publishes an interview with the head officers of the Alpha unit. It's a special KGB elite unit which was involved in taking over of the parliament building. They complain about Yeltsin's people because they were telling them there was order to shoot and kill. And they say no. Most of the leadership of this elite unit that was under the commander of the Kremlin Guards says an interesting thing today. They say that presidents change every 5 years. The officer serves in the KGB for 25 years. Do you think that the officer has to change his views every 5 years and then go to kill? That's another interesting issue, but I think this is one of the attitudes which exists in the army. And I think by using the army again, Yeltsin created a new precedent. The fragile rules of the game were broken. Thank you.
Okay. I think you will all agree that there have been many questions that have been raised, some of them even answered. And before we get to one that is on my mind, I know that Professor Zelikow would like to make just a brief comment. So why don't you do so?
Something I want to ask you to do is, if you weigh and sift what you've just heard from this panel, and reflect on the fact that President Clinton has said that policy toward Russia is his #1 foreign policy achievement. Now, the point here is not just a partisan point, though, because if he believes, then I'm happy to make it. But think about that does this mean then that Russia is at the top of his agenda where he feels he needs to do something? When he's shaping his foreign policy agenda of most urgent problems, is the #1 success story at the top of that list? And I would suggest it probably is not. And what I want you to reflect on is, do you think that's a mistake? Do you think President Clinton should elevate Russia above several other very good competitors for top slot for his foreign and domestic attention? That's a judgment that all of you will make, as well as many of the American people. But it's a judgment that I think people in Washington are already making.
I think there's an interesting way of rephrasing that, and let me try to do it. The president in the last month has been in trouble, and he has been in trouble because of issues such as Somalia, Haiti. He has been ducking on Bosnia. And last Friday evening on McNeil-Lehrer, the man who used to appear on McNeil-Lehrer but was taken away by the White House, Dave Gergen, was very much on the defensive in his appearance. And one of the things that he was trying to say was that the president, in fact, on the large issues, has been very successful. And on the large issues that he was talking about were first Russia, which he called his greatest success, and that was a line that was then picked up by everybody at the White House. Second, it was the Middle East, the Israel-PLO agreement. And third, somehow or another, it related to Japan. And those were the three issues. But what we're getting at here, in one sense, is in a redefinition of America's Cold War identification of major problems. What the White House is now trying to do in order to recapture some kind of political offensive is to divide up all of the foreign challenges into two categories. The secondary categories, namely the ones that have been bothering the president, and these larger categories that he's done, they claim very successfully, led by Russia. I'm not sure, in other words, that you should read it as a serious statement of policy so much as a way of recapturing the PR offensive at this particular point.
Maybe a symptom of complacency.
But there is a point here, and I think it did come up in all of the conversations that we've had so far. And that is, all four of our experts have talked and have used words like terrible national tragedy that Sergei talked about on the events of October 3rd and 4th. Marshall has spoken about these as a warning signal. Maybe Yeltsin has too strong an iron hand at this particular point. The question that seems to cry out is that this president and the administration, and all of the West, I must add, leaped to Yeltsin's defense when these actions were taken. Now, Marshall, you said you still are delighted with the result, even though you are unhappy about any number of the surrounding environment. But what, in fact, how are we judging what is going on in Russia if we can't even agree on a proper vocabulary for what is happening there?
Well, I'd like to respond, Marvin. I think it's a good question. I'd like to respond by trying to address some of the things the others, my panelists, fellow panelists have stated. I would agree that it's probably wrong for Clinton to have said that this Russia, if he was misinterpreted or in any properly interpreted, was one of his most impressive successes. I think it would be fair to say, however, that if Yeltsin fell, then this would be labeled as one of his greatest failures. And I think that's the context, and therefore, you know, hold your nose, hold whatever you want to do. But I would take issue with Sergei when he said maybe it was just inadvertent, but the good guys won. I wouldn't label them good guys, and I think that's the danger. We tend to look at things either in
I use
extremes.
quotation marks when I...
Well, let me say remove the quotation marks then and say the lesser of evils. I think that's a more appropriate way to do it. And I think I would feel happier going back to what Clinton did if indeed Clinton should have supported Yeltsin, but not with the sense of enthusiasm when these people are doing bad things, because I don't think he supported Fujimori in Peru when he was doing something that was comparable. So what I'm getting at is that indeed I think we have to support, and we can't find the vocabulary because it is a very treacherous area. Again, my wife said to me, "Are you going to sit back and watch another Kerensky? I mean, is that what you want?" And I certainly don't want, and that's why I wouldn't want Clinton to end up without a Yeltsin in that sense. But I do think it's essential for all of us. And listening to this panel, I could hear people saying, "My God, let's do away with Yeltsin." I don't want that. I think it's essential that we understand that we have to support what Yeltsin is, have to support Yeltsin, but keep telling him. And Congress should be doing the same thing. You're walking a very narrow line. Sometimes you've gone on the wrong side, and we hope very much that you'll come back to the right side.
Well, if we go to the central issue before us today, which is whether we are seeing a continuation of the progress toward that butchered word, democracy, in Russia, or have we seen with the actions of early October a shift away from that?
Yeah, clearly a shift away.
A shift away from it.
I think so. I mean,
But are we still to believe that come December we're going to see elections for a parliament? Are we going to see the ratification of a new constitution? Will we see elections leading to presidential campaign in June of 1994? In other words, since nothing is perfect in Russia and is not likely to be, can we settle on what is second best and still hope that we're moving in the right direction?
Well, two quick comments before Sergei comes in. Comment number one, everything remains to be shown, to be proved. We have a commitment to an election on December the 11th and 12th. We have a commitment to a presidential election 6 months later. We have a commitment to a parliament which will be a constituent assembly, and we have a commitment to that constituent assembly drawing up a constitution which presumably will be the basis for the new Russian democracy, which is not yet born. We cannot judge the obstetrician until we see the baby. And therefore, my view is that what we have done, seen essentially, is the buying of time for the possible emergence of a Russian democracy, but we are not seeing the emergence of a Russian democracy. We cannot so describe it. The second point I want to make, and this goes back to what Marshall was saying, and to some extent Phil as well, about the West. I fear, forgive me for saying, partly dazzled by the extraordinary concentration of the media on individual personalities. The West is making the profound mistake of going on and on and on about supporting Yeltsin, and they should be saying over and over, we support the Russian people in their struggle to create a new Russia, because we're looking at a country which is resentful, which is bitterly embarrassed and shamed, which feels that it deserved none of this, and we never talk about the Russian people or about Russia. We talk about one individual who Sergei says may well be a passing phenomenon, and I think that's a profound mistake.
Sergei, you have a comment. I just want to say that what we do here is invite questions from the audience too. You are not obliged to sit here and not have your say. So if you want to ask questions, there are 2 microphones down here. You may approach at this time. And when you ask your question, please do identify yourself and keep your questions brief and directed to one of our experts on the panel. Sir?
Well, my comment would be only that, first of all, we'll have to be seeing probably in December. And I think that in December, unlike the presidential elections, which I do not believe will take place in June, for many reasons, but I think that there will be elections in December to the new parliament. And also, simultaneously with this, the referendum dedicated to the new constitution. What worries me, there are 2 decrees by Yeltsin that, first of all, now 25% of the total turnover is enough for to vote this or that candidate, and especially to approve the constitution. And
You
instead
should explain that before it was, you had to have 50% of all possible voters, whether they vote or not.
Yes, plus 2/3, according to the Constitution, of the vote of the possible voters to adopt the Constitution. Today, when Yeltsin issued his decree yesterday that arithmetic majority out of those 50% who will come to the elections is enough to adopt the Constitution, will make 25%. If you make arithmetic majority, it's Constitution that might be adopted finally by 12.5% of the population.
That's about the percentage that votes in an American president, you know, about 25%.
That's
But
why
that's
Of those people who can vote.
12.5, it's twice.
It's half that.
It's half of that.
Granted.
Second thing, I don't
A Soviet constitution, I would submit, is probably less than half of the value of an American president. There we go.
And you're generous here. But my second comment will be that we are just at the beginning of another process, because all those forces in Russia united to cut off what everybody was against. I mean, the parliament, which everybody viewed as terrible. Now that the winners came to power, we are seeing already new and very deep splits among those who have just come to power. One of the reasons why the West supports Yeltsin so much is the widespread belief here that in Russia enlightened liberal Democrats are in power. I think it's a big and major illusion. It's the same part of nomenclatura, only split for different reasons, supporting different groups, today different business interests and other things, but both of these people were, enough of them, both with the parliament and with the president. And today we can see how, for example, the pro-government party, by the way, despite the emergency and curfew in Moscow, holds its convention in Moscow on Saturday before the curfew is over. None of the candidates of the democratic forces is endorsed to be part of the official ballot list. It's all the government ministers. It's very convenient. The government sitting in the Kremlin can itself vote for the non-confidence vote without going into the parliament. And guess what kind of vote will they take? And I think that if here certain limitations will not exist, it's another problem. I mean, the elections will take place. How much more democratic will they be?
It's okay, we're going to move along. Short questions, identify yourselves, short answers, and let's go, please.
Hi, I'm a housewife from Newton. My question is the process. Folks have talked about Gorbachev being a despot and the elections to come and the new constitution, okay? For us trying to understand more than what the simplistic media reports offer, can you give us a basic lesson in current civics? In other words, under what is Russia being operated now? Is it just, it appears to be just by decree. And after the elections, what's the shape going to be? Is it going to be the same shape as the current parliament, but just constituted differently?
Okay. Got it.
Ms. Williams talked about the brilliant move about including the other regions, but it's still not clear what the shape is going to be.
Okay. The shape of the future of Russia. Zelikow started before by saying he didn't know, so I'm sure Marshall does.
Well, I'm not sure I do, but let me try. What's happening now is basically Yeltsin is ruling by decree, and he's got a government that's with a prime minister The Prime Minister has been designated as the Vice President in case something should happen to Yeltsin. So Yeltsin basically is able to do what he wants, but even then, he seems to be hesitant. What he's aiming for is presumably two houses in the new parliament. One will be called the Duma, and it will be elected by, like our House of Representatives, by population groups all over. The other will be, as Shirley mentioned, depending on how you look at it, some regional council or something to that effect. Two representatives from every region. It would be something like the Senate. Indeed, he may have had our constitutional situation in mind. And presumably, they will then make decisions, but it's a combination of our form of government with a president and a Congress, and also the British form of government in that there is a prime minister with cabinet ministers, and that's called the government, and there's sometimes have disputes with Yeltsin. The prime minister, as I say, Chernomyrdin, he's also been made now the vice president, and sometimes these ministers are thrown out. Previously, they were subjected to vote, particularly for the prime minister and certain key positions like the minister of defense, by the parliament. How that evolves in the future will depend on the Constitution. Let me just add one other thing, if I may, Marvin, and that you asked the question, will this, and Shirley asked the question, will this be democratic, the election? What I worry about, and I tried to make this point earlier, is that to the extent that you suppress parties, to the extent that you control discussion, you limit discussion, you censor or you self-censor discussion, you will have elections, you'll go through the motions, but they really won't be very deep motions, and that's what worries me.
Thank you, Marshall. Question here, please.
My name is Gula Isangalieva. I'm a first-year student at Kennedy School of Government. And I have two questions. First, my question is to Shirley Williams. You said that President Clinton will have to undertake the military action when it is needed. How would you define the situation when it is needed? And could you predict the possibility that such a situation would occur? And another my question to Sergei Grigoriev. You said that President Yeltsin is irrelevant now. Whom can you consider to be irrelevant at the moment?
Very good. Thank you.
Right. I'm no warmonger, but I think the most dangerous situation that you can adopt in foreign affairs is to imply that you're about to take military action, to half take military action, and then to not take military action. It's much better not to start by suggesting that you will, because I think that what President Clinton has now done on two occasions, and I don't want anyone in this room to think that I wouldn't be equally trenchant in my criticisms of European governments or more so, but in two situations, in Bosnia and in Haiti, the President has hinted at the possibility of military action, leading brave men and women to risk their lives because they believe him, and has then pulled out, leaving those brave men and women as victims to the distrust that has arisen since. I don't believe he means to do it, but I think it's an extremely unwise, indeed dangerous way to conduct foreign policy, and that was the purpose of my remarks.
Sergei, brief answer, please.
I don't view it as censorship, no.
No.
Well, when I'm saying irrelevant, it's a principally different situation compared to Gorbachev, because in 1991, when we who worked for Gorbachev still kept convincing all of you that there is no alternative to Gorbachev, there was the alternative. It was Yeltsin. The problem today, what I see in Russia, is that Yeltsin is not yet irrelevant up to an extent that there's somebody else relevant ready to take over. And that's why I'm saying that probably Clinton administration did not have any other choice but to support Yeltsin. But on the other hand, I believe that the country needs a younger, more flexible, and more technocratically oriented president whose main order will not be the heads of his opponents, but reforms and ability to coexist and tolerate opposition.
You know, it's so difficult all the time to say who is the next man, and it certainly was true at the time with Gorbachev that nobody wanted to mention Yeltsin. But there are people around today, and you know them as well as I. There are people all around who are, in a sense, first-class people, who give every indication of being expert in certain areas. Yavlinsky came and spoke at the Russian Research Center and presented an outstanding presentation.
And for that matter, who would have ever dreamed that we'd have a governor of Arkansas as president of the United States? I mean,
Well, I would certainly vote for Yavlinsky, but
Question,
my name
please.
is Elizabeth Caputo. I'm a senior at the college, and I'm the chair of the Student Advisory Committee here at the Institute. I'd like to thank you all for speaking tonight. My question has to deal with the media's coverage of the situation in Russia. And I guess this might be a question that you yourself could answer, Mr. Kalb. I would like to just find out a little bit more about why it seems to have taken a back burner of late to the situation in Haiti, and if perhaps you could address that question. Appreciate it.
Well, the press goes with the story at hand. The story at hand at the beginning of October was what was happening in Moscow. And I remember, by the way, getting questions from students the week before asking, whatever happened to Russia? I thought that was a major issue. And I kept on saying, it is. Something will happen. It then happened on the weekend, and suddenly it was right there in the center of your television screen as well as the top of your newspaper. Why now with Haiti? Because it simply is happening now immediately after the incredibly powerful pictures from Somalia. And what was extraordinary was that the people who were running the operation in Haiti said, did you see what happened in Somalia? Much of the action, I'm not saying all of it, I'm not even saying necessarily it was the crucial factor, but a great deal of what was articulated and explained as policy was linked to what had happened in Somalia. And what had happened in Somalia was that dreadful picture of a number of Somalis dragging an American corpse. I believe he was dead at the time. That was a devastating picture. And it certainly drove many members in Congress to take action. It certainly then dominated the Sunday environment of all of those Q&A programs, and it became what reporters dealt with. Again, in the absence of a driving story, you go with Haiti. If something happened tomorrow morning, if we found out tonight that Yeltsin was suddenly ousted, you'd be surprised at how quickly Haiti would fall to page 22, even with the 6 American ships floating around the Caribbean. It is an instinct at work. It follows no mathematical formulas. I wonder sometimes whether it follows any formulas, but I think that is what happened. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is John Trinidad. I'm also a freshman here at the college. My question was touched on by Mr. Goldman, and it had to deal with President Fujimori in Peru and Yeltsin's actions and how much they compare with each other. What kind of implications does it have for the U.S. on the world stage to have, on one hand, denounced Fujimori's move, and on the other hand, have supported Yeltsin in very similar moves? And what do other countries view us now with this almost hypocritical statement?
Well, let me try. First of all, I think when Fujimori did what he did, I say we criticized him, and you're right to say that there is an unfavorable comparison. And I think that's, again, because we were looking at the alternatives, when we look at Russia, we've got this history of 70 years of communism and of the Cold War, and of course that immediately stirs in everybody's mind. And as I said, if Yeltsin had fallen, then Clinton would have gotten enormous criticism for former President Nixon, somebody that Marvin Kalb has written a book about, or about to have a book published, looking at that same question, Nixon asking who lost Russia. That would have been the question. Yeah. And so therefore I think that Clinton said, okay, he's got warts, but he's our man, and it's the only way we're going to get along with him. Now, also in fairness, here we're making a big fuss about Russia, but you look at China, the Tiananmen Square, we're doing very nicely with China now. Tiananmen Square is a bad memory, but somehow or other we've gotten over it. China, however, still suppresses human rights. They still do these things, and we get along, we accommodate it. For that matter, we got along with Gorbachev. In the early years even, when things weren't all so nice. So foreign policy in this sense is, I think you've got to pick what's there and hope that you can do the best you can. And I hope that if there's any message that evolves from this panel, that we hope we can do better with what we've got and try to nudge that person instead of simply applauding him almost without criticism when criticism is deserved. So I think your question is a good one, but I think foreign policy, that's what you need diplomats for, to do the unpalatable.
Thank you, Marshall. Yes, please.
My name is Dick Stone. I'd like to ask a question. It's amazing to me how little I have personally seen in print. I do try to read a lot about this, about the election. I'd like to get your views on analyzing the complexion of the new parliament compared to the old one. Many of these questions have been slightly alluded to by the questioners, but also comes this great question about the future leadership. Are we going to see future leadership in the new parliament?
Are you asking about the new parliament,
The new parliament
still to be voted
still to
in?
be. I mean, what's going to happen? Because you don't know, it seems to me we have to say something. We don't see anything in print at all about this. It's very hard even to begin to
I know,
understand
it's a
the
marvelous sense of responsibility on the part of the press. Not to leap ahead and tell you what's going to happen when it hasn't happened yet. But Sergey, you tell us what's going to
I'd
happen.
also like to hear the views of the professor on electoral politics as well.
You will.
Well, what I will say about the elections, today, Deputy Chief of Yeltsin's staff, and I still don't know whether somebody who worked for the Chief of Staff in the White House did say that kind of things, had a press conference where he announced that President Yeltsin believes that Russia's Choice Party will get 38% of the vote. That some other groups like Shakrai's party, which is second biggest, will get about 19% of the vote. That Yavlinsky and company will get about 11% of the vote. Then he made a pause and said, as far as the opposition parties are concerned, the president has no prediction about that. So is it a recommendation for the media or for the troops? We don't know. But
Or the
certainly,
vote counters.
yeah, for the vote counters, of course. I mean, there was no illusion about the referendum, how the vote was counted, and there's no illusion for what's going to happen in December, because we can certainly predict that in December, the pro-government party, Russia's Choice, will probably be the biggest party represented in this new parliament. There's one problem here, though, because today even Yeltsin's hand-picked Constitutional Assembly voted against Yeltsin's decree allowing government ministers become deputies in the parliament, which was under Stalin, was a regular practice in the Soviet Union under Stalin and under Brezhnev. Then people will have to make choices whether the government ministers, who are quite well known to the population, will still want to be deputies or be on the ballot lists, or whether they will be trying to pick up somebody else less known and correspondingly less popular. My prediction is still that this will not significantly affect the counting of votes in the country, but there will be certain elements of opposition allowed. Although the Ministry of Justice has prepared a list of parties, and this document somehow got into the Russian independent newspaper, Nezavisimaya Gazeta, which published this list saying that 28 parties are not recommended for any public participation. None of their political rallies are allowed, together with a lot of other things. So we will probably have to, this happened in Russian history. The parallels are tragic, because that's exactly what happened when Tsar Nicholas II was dissolving the Duma, the first Russian parliament. We don't have to remind all of you here what happened to the Tsar as a result of his brilliant tactics and all sort of other things. But nevertheless, it's a widespread practice, and that's probably what we should expect.
Professor Williams?
3 quick points on top of what Sergei said. Number one, there are no things that one would recognize as parties yet in Russia, nor very much, it must be said, even in Central and Eastern Europe. Parties form, reform, break up, are recreated. It's really rather like the revolutionary period in the United States. You can't look at a secure party because almost everything forms as a faction around a person or a couple of people. Number two, the Council of Europe and others are worried about the ballot in Russia and how secure it is. Not that there are intentions to muck it up, but that the process of producing ballots and those ballots being secret and so on is a kind of new process. And an election which is rushed as quickly as December is one where certainly in some regions there will be questions about the validity of the vote. And I say that with no reflection on Russia. It's just going to happen. And thirdly, there's a constant muddle, I think Sergei will bear me out, as to what the distinction is between the legislature and the executive. And that is also not only true of Russia, it's also true of Ukraine, it has been until recently true in Poland, with the parliament seeing itself as having executive powers, and the executive seeing itself as having the right to interfere directly in the legislature. And given there'll be no constitution a new constitution by the time that the elections take place. I think we're going to have many Russian voters who are not clear what it means to elect a legislator and will therefore be deeply influenced by who the leader tells them to vote for.
Question here, please.
My name is Alexander Rasolimo of International Strategy Associates. Several months ago, Moscow police stormed an airplane and arrested 30 Russian atomic scientists who were taking off for North Korea, presumably to work on North Korea's atomic program. Quite recently, perhaps a coincidence, perhaps not, South Korea has announced a series of agreements with Russia to invest in Russia and help with Russia's defense conversion. My question is, how safe or unsafe are Russia's nuclear weapons, nuclear scientists, and is there a threat of nuclear blackmail?
Thank you. Professor Zelikow.
Not very safe. There are two discrete problems. One is the problem of overt nuclear proliferation. Russia losing any semblance of control over the more than 1,800 nuclear warheads in Ukraine and the number of nuclear warheads in Kazakhstan. That problem is not close to a solution and is getting worse as the Ukrainian government and the entire situation in Ukraine also gets worse and less predictable. The U.S. government is hitting this problem very hard this month, and we'll see whether they'll have any success. They thought they'd had some success at the end of the summer, and it all fell apart during September. The second problem, though, which in some ways is even graver, is nuclear weapons security inside Russia, because the nuclear weapons themselves are scattered around hundreds of different sites in a bewildering variety of custodial arrangements. They are not, most of them, affected by arms control agreements, since the majority of these weapons are not in the operational part of Russia's forces. There is already reports of smuggling of nuclear materials that ought to be under lock and key that have been confirmed, although none of the news reports of smuggling of fissional materials have been confirmed.
Smuggled where?
Into Eastern Europe and elsewhere, small radioactive isotopes, other things that in any normal country would not be in commerce in the normal way, would not be carried around in people's pockets. But there are no confirmed reports of fissionable material, serious amounts of fissionable material that have actually been smuggled. Nothing about that's been confirmed. But we do know that just about everything in the Russian military is for sale. You can read ads in the New York Times offering you the chance to fly MiG-31 aircraft over Moscow with a Russian test pilot flying it for you. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's the Korean story you mentioned. There are, Russian press has also reported on covert transfers of ballistic missile guidance technology, cruise missiles, and anti-submarine warfare technology to China, in addition to the overt arms sales traffic that Russia has renewed with China. There are a variety of activities that are going on with Iran in addition to the sale of submarines. All of this is very troubling. And the United States has a series of policies that are trying to address this problem. We don't have the time to go into detail about those policies. But the bottom line is, yes, you should be worried. Yes, the government should consider this very important. How important? You can be as good a judge of that as I can. If we lose control over the nuclear materials that can make 5 nuclear weapons, how important is that compared, say, to Haiti or Somalia put together? And what does that then dictate about the priority attention the U.S. government ought to be giving these issues?
Phil, do we know specifically that Soviet fissionable material or Soviet nuclear weapons have been sent out of Russian territory into foreign countries, in other words, outside of the former Soviet Union?
Except for Cuba, in the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, where we do believe a number of nuclear weapons were actually deployed into Cuba at that time and then removed.
No, I'm talking about the last couple of years.
No.
No.
There is no evidence that the Russians have actually moved nuclear weapons outside of Russia, except, of course, for the nuclear weapons of the former Soviet Union that are outside of Russia.
And what about, I mean, this report on Soviet scientists possibly going to Korea, that's one report. What about the reports that we haven't heard? Is there any reason to believe that Soviet nuclear scientists have ended up in other countries? Do we know anything about that?
We know that Russian arms scientists, not necessarily nuclear scientists, have gone to other countries.
Like what
We know that we know that some Russian scientists were believed to have gone to North Korea. There are also some reports of Russian armed scientists having ended up in China. And then there are other news reports that are just too fragmentary to be able to tell what's involved. We don't have any hard evidence that either important nuclear material or important nuclear expertise has yet been lost. It is quite possible that if it had been lost, we would not know.
Okay, thank you. Yes, please.
This sounds like the search for the Russian Werner von Braun. My name is Zachary Karabal. I'm at the Goldman Institute at the Center for International Affairs. My question is to any and all who are interested in taking it, but it's a question essentially about what is the nature of American influence or capacity to do anything at all about what's going on in Russia. I think there is perhaps a tendency coming from habit to assume that our stance one way or another actually matters in that situation. And Professor Goldman mentioned who could have expected a governor of Arkansas. It doesn't strike me that if we were to suddenly reverse base and support the governor of the Siberian province X over Yeltsin, that would make a lot of difference within a Russian context. It might make a certain amount of difference within the American context. So I would like to ask, perhaps there's genuine disagreement here, and I'd like to hear the input as to what you actually think the United States can and cannot do other than rhetorical on the pittance of aid which the Congress is actually willing to extend.
Well, right. Well, one, as a non-American, consistently less than people kid themselves. I've seen United States claim the credit for the fall of the Berlin Wall and credit for the fall of Brezhnev in Russia and so on. We all do it. Most countries go around announcing that they have been the key factors in some great public outcome, which is good. You don't hear them talk too often about how they're the key factor in some great public outcome, which is bad. The United States has more influence than anybody else, and at the end of the day, it's probably 2%. Something miles less than people kid themselves. It is.
Mrs. Zelikow.
We don't have a lot of ability to tell the Russian people what form of government they will have. We do actually have a good deal of ability if we apply that to fairly narrow and concrete tasks, of which most of the national security objectives I mentioned fall into this category. We have a lot of leverage in both Russia and Ukraine for a variety of reasons. That leverage is palpably insufficient to ensure those countries become democracies. It is not necessarily insufficient to assure they adopt specific security policies on specific issues.
Marcia, do you want to answer?
Yes, if I could. First of all, we've been making all kinds of recommendations and in some cases taking credit where credit is not due. In the process, however, we have caused lots of problems, and there's a growing degree of anti-Americanism. They're either claiming things that we didn't deserve to do or claiming things that we did do and the Russian people don't like. The economic reforms, there are many Russians, including many of those people in the parliament, many of whom were arrested, who said that the whole effort at economic reform was an American conspiracy to humiliate and destroy Russia. And there are people who believe that. Now, I don't think our influence went anywhere near that amount, but it does turn out, of course, that there were many economic advisors. And some of these economic advisors really did very concrete things that were very useful. But because the reforms have not worked out, the whole picture is being painted in a very negative way. And so there is growing resentment, partly because of problems, partly because of growing income inequality. And just we're being blamed for almost anything that goes wrong. And the Russians historically, whenever there was a problem, always looked outside. Why did we have this problem? It wasn't from within that was caused. It was some conspiracy on the outside. And we're now part of that conspiracy.
Thank you. Question, please.
Yes. My name is Barbara Terry, and this question was going to be just for Ms. Williams, but I think for Mr. Zelikow also, because he just touched on it. I just came back from living in Prague in the Czech Republic for 8 months. And it was a very enlightening experience. Ms. Williams, I agree with you. I believe you said that Yeltsin could not be a budding Democrat because of the absence of a democratic tradition. And I saw that in Prague, too. My question is that the right type of government for a country that doesn't have that kind of tradition? And if it is, how do you see it adopting that kind of tradition and learning the ropes?
That's not an easy question to ask in 30 seconds, which is all that Marvin will give me, but I'll have a go.
Come on, take 40.
Take 40. Incidentally, let me just start by saying that I very much agree with what Marshall said. And I agree with what Marshall said because I think that one of the things that we in the West have failed to understand is that the democratic transition, is going to be very long, very slow, involves changing organic structures and not just bringing a quick fix, and involves that most difficult of things known as building the concept of a civic society. And that may take 100 years. It isn't something you can do in 10 months or even in 5 years. So I think that we in the West have raised expectations both for ourselves and for the peoples east of the Vistula, which are unreal ones. What can you do? Well, first, recognizing it's an extremely slow process. I don't mean it has to take 100 years, but it certainly has to take years. You can do a great deal to support and sustain the development of democratic institutions by exchanges, by education, by bringing people over here and taking people over there. But it's not done by a quick fix, and it's not done by shock therapy. So whatever one does in the economic field, in my view, the great failure of the West has been to believe that you could produce an economic fix which didn't require any slow, patient work on the democratic institution building. And I'll end with a quotation. To me, it's one of the great quotations of the world by Max Weber, who said, "Politics is the boring of hard boards." And you could say that building democratic institutions is the boring of hard boards. And we don't seem to understand that that takes a long time.
You know, just to add a point to that, I have heard within the last 24 hours of 2 grants of $3 million each to news organizations in order to build a freedom of the press environment and operation in Eastern Europe and in Russia. And when they came to me and asked whether I would like to join, I loved the figures. I thought they were most appealing. But I thought it was absolutely ridiculous at the same time. There are an awful lot of people in the West who are making themselves feel good by going into the East and thinking that they are bringing the poor benighted people of the East the blessings of democracy from the West. And some of the people over there are not even aware of the definition of some of these words. But they're very smart. They can use the words in the same way that Western politicians can use those words for their own advantage and to their own advantage. And they use that constantly. But Shirley's point about raising expectations beyond any reasonable chance of satisfaction is one of the great sins that we all engage in today. Your question, please.
My name is Matthew Benke. I'm an undergraduate here at Harvard. I have a question which is, in essence, a follow-up to the question before the last one, Zachary's question. Assuming that we could, to some degree, agree about what American interests are in Russia right now, if any of you who are interested in answering this question could tomorrow inherit the situation yet have ultimate power over American policy, what would you do?
Over American policy?
Yes.
I think that Sergei ought to have American policy. Go.
I spoke about this already. I mean, in terms of American policy, I mean, we've come, actually, well, it's hard to choose a proper term. What happened to Russia today, that as a result of many things, mistakes of the leadership, but also as a result of very legitimate processes of the very complicated transformation of the country, which for decades and for centuries did not know any democratic traditions and especially market traditions. All those difficulties which emerge today are quite legitimate, plus some mistakes are made. But we've come to the situation where, again, because of all the mess in Russia, which was and is still in Russia today, with all the problems, a lot of people, especially here, I think, wouldn't mind seeing some kind of enlightened authoritarianism for some time, just to establish order, bring some kind of a Russian Pinochet to control the situation, to have the situation under kind of a regulated control, but at the same time developing market economy, developing market relations, maintaining close contacts with the West. I don't know, again, I mean, this is a very interesting night when we all say we don't know the answers. My biggest fear is that you could have had enlightened authoritarian regime in Chile when the Chilean military were trained in the United States, with the Russian military which were trained in a different place. And with the Russian authoritarianism never been enlightened, just because there were not enough people enlightened, period.
Right.
It's very hard to have a situation like this. But there's a different attitude here, where again I will say that if I were in Russia, I probably would have not liked what's happening today in Russia, much less. Being in Massachusetts here, I have a lot of good motivations to think that maybe it was the safer way out for many reasons. And that's the double standard which I am conscientiously applying, tearing my heart and conscience and my mind into pieces, but unfortunately that's how complicated the situation is.
Thank you, Sergei. Marshall?
Let me try, Matthew. I think, first of all, we have to start thinking small and slow. And I think we have to accustom ourselves to the fact that we're not going to get a quick fix, as Shirley mentioned, and not only in political institutions, but economic institutions. So therefore, what do? I think you have to take a very long-range view and say, we've got to start building up institutions and support them. How can we do that? Well, I can think in terms of the economy. I think what we should do is try to build that infrastructure which was destroyed during nationalization and the effort to build these giant institutions, gigantomania, that the Russians prided themselves on. They don't have a small infrastructure, so therefore, when market signals begin to start flashing, nobody knows how to respond to them properly. They've been trained to respond to them in just the opposite way. So you try to finance small new businesses, small new private farms. We've actually done something like this in Eastern Europe, and it's had some degree of success. They're called enterprise funds. And there's one in every East European country, and we need to create one in Russia. What is happening now is that we talk about very big things. We talk about helping privatization. So as I say, we make these private state enterprises that are monsters, and they don't operate any more efficiently. Finally, I think we also have to be very careful. There's enormous pressure from President Nixon, from President Clinton now, and from the Congress to get out, don't stand there, spend money. Now, in the Marshall Plan, that seemed to work because the West Europeans said, we have a program, here's what we need the money for, give it to us. The Russians haven't done it. It's been too much chaos. And so AID, and this is the scandal of the future, says, I've got all this money, they're putting pressure on me. We've had these G7 meetings, and every time we go and somebody says, have you spent the money yet? And we say, no, we haven't spent it. So spend it. So how do they spend it? They can't just give it to the Russians. So what they do is they go to the Beltway bandits, these consulting firms, and they say, I've got a $200 million contract. Marvin is getting phone calls from people saying, help us for $3 million to create freedom of the press. I'm getting phone calls, help me set up environmental controls, help me set up democratic controls, help me set up management controls. And what is happening is that the Beltway bandits are getting the money, not the Russians. And someday somebody's going to have a scandal saying, where did the money go? It went to the Americans, not to the Russians. And the Russians are going to have to pay this back for reports that they couldn't care less about. And that seems to me to be the wrong way. So you think slow, go slowly, and try to create new institutions and not fatter purses. Yeah.
You've got time for, I think, one, possibly two more questions, depending on the length of the answers. Please.
My name is Ron Emitter. I'm a research student in the graduate school. And I'd like to ask a question which probably is best handled perhaps by Lady Williams as an electoral person, which is going back to Yeltsin and balancing off electoral questions and international ones. If you were called up tomorrow by Boris Yeltsin as his personal advisor, and he asked you what to do about the Kuril Islands off the Pacific coast, what would you answer to him?
I'm afraid that, well, economically, I would say flog them for as much as you can get to the Japanese. Pardon?
And lose the election?
Well, I was coming to that. You're being too clever. I said that economically, that's what I would say. Politically, I know that that would probably lose with the election. So what I would probably do would be to send an emissary who I could disown to talk to the Japanese about the possibility of reaching an agreement with them after the election in return for substantial Japanese aid. And the Japanese, I have to say, I mean, again, echoing Marshall, are much cleverer at not giving their aid to local consultants who then absorb it all. Much more of that money would come to Russia.
Sergei has a
The
question.
emissary was there, Mr. Bourbulis, and then he was disavowed by right on the eve of the trip by the foreign ministry, but nothing happened. I mean, the situation is so dramatic with the economy in Russia today that, again, I mean, speaking about other things, not emotional, I'd rather cancel the election and grab the cash from the Japanese. Because what will happen at that time is that there will be enough money to spend on consumer goods and to set up enough funds like for the guarantees for Western investments and other things that it will allow to have people lining up not around the buildings of local Soviets, but in their lines to obtain goods, and that will help in a certain way to solve the situation for a number of years. That's what I would have done if I were Yeltsin, because as a politician I think about only so many years in power. But there's another big problem with the Japanese money. Had Yeltsin gotten the Japanese money today, it would have helped him to stay in power and keep the people happy. But there would have been no reform, no change. So in the future, they would be looking for another piece of territory to sell. That probably would be the Eastern Prussia on the agenda, or a number of other nice pieces. And that's the paradox of it.
I think we can get in one more fast question and answer.
All right, great. Thanks a lot. I'm Aram Shavam, a freshman at the college. I had a question for either Mr. Grigoriev or Mr. Goldman. Two main sort of themes in Russian history are oppression, i.e. the Mongol hordes, Napoleon or Hitler, and central leaders with almost cults of personality, Ivan, Peter, Stalin, so on. Do you think that these factors are both incompatible and inconsistent with democracy? And do you believe that these factors will prevent a real democracy from existing in Russia?
I really like that question. You ask your question too. We'll try to do it together.
Okay, I'm a Nieman Fellow, and I wanted to ask a question about the economy. How likely do you think it is that economic reforms will advance now, and how important is that for Yeltsin's political future?
Okay, I'm going to assign Marshall that quick answer for that last question on the economy.
I'm not optimistic about the economic reform process. I don't really see anything having changed fundamentally. The bank is still going, it's not just the bank creating new credits that create inflation, it's also the legislature and the government, as it were, in this case, continuing to say we can't close down factories of 20, 30,000 workers when that's the only factory in town, the only employment in town, and it means also the schools and the hospitals and all the other social services. So that these institutions which were built up cannot be destroyed overnight, and the market structure is not there. I don't want to say that there cannot be change. I don't think Russia is a prisoner of history. But I do say that to break out of that prison is going to be a very difficult task, and it's going to be there'll be gradual change, but they'll be lucky if they get back to where they were in 1980.
Phil Zelikow will answer that last question to make an attempt to answer that.
This is a university audience. Let me make two analytical points. First, a correlation between economic growth and political stability. Imperfect. Ask the Iranians. And that's because I think that those two issues are blurred together a lot. And I think part of the answer to that relates back to the cultural points that you mentioned. The second point is also very interesting analytically. What is the relationship between democratization of a society without experience in democracy, as you mentioned, and political stability and resolution of ethnic conflict? Answer is correlation is not good. Democratization in ethnically divided societies more often than not polarizes and institutionalizes ethnic conflict unless you create decision rules that create incentives to build multi-ethnic coalitions, which is very hard to do and is very rare. There are precedents, by the way, for this pattern already emerging in the former Soviet Union. The point then goes back to if democratization is seen to visibly fail, if economic growth, even if it occurs, is not a panacea, then the cultural images you refer to and the overwhelming desire to get some public order, which is the first requirement of government, a requirement this government is visibly failing to carry out for its people, will become overwhelming and irresistible.
Let me just wrap it up by a simple thought that maybe we want and we expect too much of Russia too soon. Marshall used an expression before, small and slow. Now that may be inconsistent with the run and the drift of Russian history, which is large and fast, and the Russian word stikhinos, explosive, spontaneous, comes to mind and ends up defining so much of the nature of Russian history. But at the same time, that fractured word, that butchered word, democracy, which every president loves to use because it makes it so much easier to go to the Hill and get money, that is going to take a long time. It took us a long time, and there's no reason to believe that a society with absolutely no tradition in democracy is going to do it any more quickly than the United States of America. But I want to thank all of our panelists and thank you all for coming. Thank you very much. It's a terrific subject. You know, we can come back.
It was great. I enjoyed that.
We'll be doing this with the
I like
pace
your
of
points. I was actually
word by word.